Hello and welcome to our public open house for Douglas County. We're going to cover flood risk for you this evening, and we're going to cover some slides and information in the next 15 to 20 minutes. So welcome everyone, and we'll go ahead and see who's in the room. First, I'll hand it over to Stacy with Mile High Flood District.
Hello, I'm Stacy Thompson with the Mile High Flood District, and I'm the floodplain manager.
I'm Britt Seymour at the Mile High Flood District, engineering services manager overseeing floodplain management.
And Brad?
Yes, this is Brad Robinson. I'm with Douglas County Public Works Engineering. We implement the minimum requirements of the National Flood Insurance Program and work on keeping our floodplain maps up to date with other communities and the Mile High Flood District. So thank you for joining us.
I'm Michael Grabchek with the Town of Parker's Stormwater Division under Engineering and Public Works. Work extensively with kind of keeping up to date with the floodplain mapping for the town.
Good evening, I'm Chris Gaines with FEMA Region 8, and I'm the mapping lead for the state of Colorado.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Doug Mahan. I'm the National Flood Insurance Program Coordinator for the state, and I work for the Colorado Water Conservation Board, which is part of the Department of Natural Resources.
Good evening, I'm Erin May. I'm the National Flood Insurance Program Insurance Specialist for FEMA's Region 8, and I'll be going over some of the insurance implications this evening.
And good evening, my name is John Pink. I'm a mapping contractor to FEMA. We are the team who took the district's data and their studies with the flood insurance maps here.
Hi, and I'm Sam Bug, and I'm with Resilience Action Partners, and we do community outreach and risk communications, and we are a FEMA contractor, and wanted to welcome you this evening, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Thanks, Sam. So why is flood risk important? No matter where you live or work, some risk of flooding exists, and flood risk can vary within the same neighborhood and even property to property. So it's important to know your property's flood risk, and that flood risk can change over time. You also can take action to mitigate your flood risk. And it's important to know that most homeowners insurance and renters insurance do not cover flood damage. And on average, 40% of flood insurance claims come from properties that are located outside of the high-risk flood zones. And we have experienced floods here in Colorado and even in the metro area. The photo in the upper right corner is from the 2013 floods, and that's Westerly Creek in Aurora and near Denver in the Central Park neighborhood. So why are we here? Well, the new flood maps for Newland Gulch will become effective on December 2nd. And this open house is intended to answer common questions and show you where to find additional information. We will show you how to view the flood maps to better understand your individual risk, what to do to lower your risk and protect your investments, as well as learn about local permit requirements for development or substantial improvements in the high-risk flood area. So the National Flood Insurance Program is a voluntary program that's generally overseen by FEMA, managed by the communities, and enforced by lenders. Your community participates in the National Flood Insurance Program essentially through an agreement with FEMA. Through the agreement, your community has agreed to enforce floodplain management regulations that meet or exceed the minimum National Flood Insurance Program requirements. And in exchange, federally backed flood insurance is made available to everyone in the community. And you do not have to live in the high risk zone to be able to purchase flood insurance. And through participation in the National Flood Insurance Program, your community is also eligible for federal disaster assistance grants and loans. And the ultimate goal of the program is to reduce disaster suffering. So as I've stated, flood risk does change over time, and FEMA requires communities to maintain and update the flood risk information. And as Brad noted, the Mile High Flood District partners with local communities to identify and communicate revised flood risk information. And we do this through the development of flood hazard area delineation studies that we refer to by the acronym FHAD, F-H-A-D. These updated FAD studies capture changes that have impacted existing floodplains using best available data and technology to best represent actual flood risk. In the physical map revision, the PMR is the FEMA process to incorporate the FAD study into the FEMA flood map products. And updated flood maps provide a more accurate picture of your property's flood risk and your community's risk. And the flood maps are used to ensure land development activities comply with minimum local, state, and federal floodplain management regulations. And then insurance agents and lenders also use the flood maps to determine insurance requirements. So this slide shows the overall physical map revision project timeline. The project was initiated back in 2018. And the asterisk denotes steps in the process that included community review and comment. And individual notification letters were mailed to affected property owners last summer prior to the 90-day appeal period. And again, last month in October, ahead of the effective date. And flood risk may be changing for some and insurance requirements. So what do we mean when we talk about flood risk when it comes to the mapping? Well, flood risk impacts everyone, and it's a degree of risk. It's high, moderate, or low risk. And for those of you with high risk, the high risk flood zone is also known as the special flood hazard area or the 100-year floodplain. And the high risk flood zone consists of both the flood fringe and the floodway. And the flood fringe is the area shown in solid blue. And the floodway is depicted with the cross-hatched area. And the floodway is the highest hazard area of the floodplain with the highest flood depths and velocities. And the moderate risk zone is the area shown in the tan color. And that's generally the 500-year floodplain area. And then all areas outside of the high risk or moderate risk are considered low risk. And it's really important to understand that low risk does not mean no risk. And then we do also want to make you aware that the colors may be different when viewing flood risk mapping on different websites. That could include the town's website or the county's, as well as the Mile High Flood Districts. The image we're showing here is from the FEMA's National Flood Insurance layer, and the colors reflect FEMA's requirements for mapping on flood insurance rate maps. I think with that, I will turn it over to Erin.
Okay, I'm having a little bit of trouble with the audio on my end, so. Hi, everybody. Can you all hear me? I'm having a little bit of trouble with audio on my end. So if you have troubles, let me know. Let's talk about why we identify flood risk. Well, as Stacy mentioned earlier, flood risk changes over time. That can be encroaching development in the area. You know, the less green space you have, the less place that water has to go to dissipate and absorb into the soil. And so those risks change with time. There's a lot of factors that can contribute to that. And what's really important to note is that everybody lives with some level of risk. Whenever I'm at a flood meeting, somebody inevitably says, "Oh, I'm not in a flood zone." Well, everybody's in a flood zone. It's just whether it's a high risk, moderate risk, or low risk. And sadly, we are seeing an increase of claims for those properties that are in a low risk flood zone. In our region, we're seeing that risk be as high as 40%, 35 to 40% for our annual claims. And that's changed. I've been with the program for 12 years, and we used to say about 20%. So that's a pretty dramatic increase in a short amount of time. And then again, this is a national average. You have a 26% chance of experiencing a flood over a 30-year mortgage. And that's a 1 in 4 chance. And what I think most people don't really understand is that flooding is the #1 natural disaster worldwide for loss of life and property. And so it's important to know your risk and identify whether you want to carry flood insurance and what that, what you can do for your flood insurance options. So with that, let's go to the next slide. Can I advance it? Yes, I can, or somebody moved it for me. Thank you. Okay, let's talk about some of the flood insurance basics. Lenders do require flood insurance if you're in any high-risk flood zone. Here in Colorado, that means any A zone. And that loan is federally backed. There are privately owned mortgages where they might not require flood insurance, but I do find that private mortgage lenders usually require flood insurance even if you're in a high-risk flood zone as well. For most flood insurance, there is a 30-day waiting period, except for the exceptions that I've got listed here below. The one in particular that we're going to focus in on tonight is the fact that there's a 1-day waiting period following your upcoming map revision for 1 year. So what that means is for the year following your flood map, you have, as long as you go out and write within that 12-month period, and we really encourage people to write within about 10.5 months before that year deadline, so that the policy has time to be underwritten and put into force. And you have a 1-day waiting period once you get that payment into your insurance company. And then we're going to talk next about what risk rating 2.0, it's a term that we use within FEMA, but that basically means we're changing the way we rate policies pretty dramatically, and that went into effect last month for new policies. Existing policyholders won't see changes to the way they're rated until their policy renews in 2022. And let's go to the next slide and we can talk about that a little bit further. So on this slide, we're just going to talk really briefly, and this is the same as it was in the old rating system and the new rating system. This is the maximum amount of coverage that's available through the NFIP. So for residential structures, that's 250,000 of building coverage, 100,000 of contents coverage. That's the maximum amount available. For non-residential or other residential structures, that's 500,000 for both building and contents. And then renters coverage is the same contents maximum, which is $100,000. And we encourage any of you property owners who know you're moving into a high-risk flood zone to notify any renters of this new risk that's been identified, so that they can determine whether they want to carry contents coverage. In most cases, a lender is not going to require coverage for contents only unless they have some ownership of those contents. So a lot of times, maybe in commercial buildings, let's say it's a dental office and they've got a lease on their or a loan on their dental equipment. That might be a scenario where the lender would require coverage on contents. And then in the last few years, they've changed that maximum deductible to allow people to bring their rates down somewhat. It used to be our maximum deductible was only $5,000 for residential. Now it's $10,000. And our minimum deductible is about $1,250. So, you can really protect yourself with that lower risk deductible if you want to. If you want to self-insure for the first $10,000, you can do that as well. And then the maximum for non-residential is $50,000. With that, the other thing I like to mention on this slide is if your home or building is worth more than this amount of coverage, you can always purchase excess coverage on top of our coverage to insure for more than the 250. We recognize here in Colorado that most of our homes in Colorado are worth more than 250,000. And excess coverage is available here. So if anybody has questions on that, they can reach out to me afterwards and I can answer those questions and send you in the right direction. Let's go to the next slide here. So there's been a lot of questions about what risk rating 2.0 is going to mean to policyholders. And so they did a statistical research on how that was going to affect each state, all the way down to the zip code. So you can go to the link that's provided below, or you can just type in FEMA Equity in Action. And this page will pop right up and you can scroll down to the bottom and get into the zip code information in a spreadsheet. But this is the overall averages. As you can see here in Colorado, the bulk of people are not going to see a big change in their rates. Some people, 43%, are going to actually see their rates go down. 48% are going to see on average less than $120 a year in increase. And then we've got about 9% of people, which is probably the most of the folks that all of us that are the officials that help you understand their flood risk will probably hear from, or maybe not, you never know. But that, less than 10% of people are going to see a very significant change in their premium rating based on that, the new rating structure that we're using. So let's move on to the next slide and we can talk about how we're going to rate policies now that things have changed with this new application that we're using. So what's really cool is FEMA has spent a lot of money developing a rating engine that all insurance companies, and I can only see one column there. Can anybody else see? But there they are, they're coming in now. Okay, so now all of the insurance companies have access to the single rating engine. So there won't be any errors from company to company putting in data wrong. There's one data tool that inputs all that information. And what's very nice for insurance agents is it's only 6 questions that they have to ask a policyholder now in order to rate a policy. Before they had to ask some pretty complicated questions. And it was a struggle for agents. They weren't as interested in writing flood. So hopefully this means that agents will be more open to writing flood insurance in the future because this tool's a piece of cake for them. On the left, we're going to talk a little bit about the geographic variables. And for the most part, it's the distance from the flooding source. So the further away you are from the flooding source, the lower your risk, obviously. And then we also talk about that local relative elevation, which is basically the height of the water as it is now. In the past, well, we don't need to go into what it was in the past, but this is a better tool for most people, I think, to understand than the way we rated in the past. And then the elevation of the structure relative to that flooding source. So obviously, the higher you sit above the water, the lower your risk, once again. And then some of those other tools are just based on well-known and understood tools that have been around for quite some time. MSA is a territory tool that basically rates your community. Is it rural? Is it metro? What's the density, basically? So higher density, higher risk in most cases. And then the last 3 items on that list just talk about the classification of that flooding source. And those classifications determine the risk for your property. So the second 2 columns they're a little bit different, but they're similar to what we've had in the past. So they're not a dramatic change. But probably the biggest characteristic that's new is we're actually going to be rating based on the replacement cost value. In the past, we didn't, and there was some inequity in how the properties were rated because of that. A lower cost home was paying the same rate as a higher cost home. And so those lower cost homes were actually paying more based on the fact that the rates were the same. And now we're going to include replacement cost value in how we rate a property. So those higher cost homes are going to pay what's equitable for their replacement cost value, and the lower cost homes will pay appropriate replacement cost values for their homes. So it should be more equitable for everyone involved. And then The other big change is we're now looking at first floor height that's above ground and comparing that to the lowest adjacent grade. So what that means is, here's your first living floor, here's the grade on the outside of the house. What's that difference? And that'll be something that the tool actually, that the rating engine actually determines for your property, unless you submit an elevation certificate. And an elevation certificate is generally completed by a surveyor or engineer, and then submitted to underwriting, and they can see if that helps your rate as well, but it's not a requirement. And so the rating engine will make that determination for you. And then, as always, there are mitigation discounts, which can be elevating property, properly venting a crawl space, for example, those flood openings. Is the property elevated on piers, posts, and pile? It's very common in coastal areas, but those things can be a big advantage in rating a property. And it's something that people can mitigate after the home has been built to possibly help their rates. And so that's something to discuss with your local floodplain administrator and your agent to see how that might help you. And then the other variables on the far right are pretty much the same as they were before, except that let's talk a little bit about statutory discounts, because in the past we've had grandfathered rates. And I think actually, let's move on to the next slide, because we can talk about it so people have time to look at the, So grandfathering and preferred risk policies are going to be going away under risk rating 2.0. So anybody who has maybe grandfathered in on an old map, the fact that they were in a low risk flood zone, they could lock in that flood zone, not the rate, and be grandfathered and pass that grandfathered policy on to a new somebody who buys their property. And preferred risk policies were available, but now everything is going to be rated based on distance from the water source. So these essentially subsidies through the National Flood Insurance Program will be going away. So no more grandfathering, no more preferred risk policies. Everybody's rated the same through the rating engine. If you have an existing policy that is preferred risk or grandfathered, you're going to go on this glide path. And that glide path will be a premium increase of 15 to 18% a year, every year, until you reach full risk rate. And what's kind of cool is on your renewal notices, it'll show you what that full risk rate premium will be in the future. And it'll show you the glide path discounts that you get and any other discounts that you might qualify for. And then this year's premium will show at the bottom. So it's going to be hopefully a lot clearer to people. I think that felt nebulous in the past when they knew that premium increase was coming. They didn't know what the end premium would be. Now we can tell you that. So that's kind of handy with this new tool. I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to say on this slide. The other thing that I do want to mention that I just thought of is that people can still transfer an existing policy over to a new homeowner. So if you're on this glide path, you can transfer that policy over to a new homeowner and they will continue on that glide path until they get to that full risk premium. If they buy a new policy through their agent, and let's say you get a refund on your policy, they would lose that. So you can provide documentation too. There's two ways to get that glide path for the new homeowner, but it's easier to just transfer the existing policy. Let's go to the next slide. There's one more slide, I think, Sam, if you want to slide forward here. There we go. So this kind of just talks about some of the implications and what the specifics are. So if you're being mapped in for the first time, that shows you what that's going to look like. You will be on the glide path. If you're grandfathered, you will be going on to the glide path. And the last column there just talks about how that works based on when your policy renews. And so it's a little confusing, I realize, but if you've got questions on that, feel free to call me. And the one thing I like people to know is that since we've got 43% of policies in the state who may see a discount, you can call your agent and ask for a quote in the new rating engine and see if it helps you. If it helps you, then you can revise your policy depending on the date of when your policy renews, and get a refund. So that's something good to know. And I think that is everything I wanted to cover. I'm not sure I missed anything. I didn't even use my notes as I planned on. So I think I'll turn that back over to you guys.
And Stacy, this one's over to you.
Thanks, Erin. So what can you do if you think your property's been incorrectly mapped in the high risk flood zone? There is a process through FEMA where you can submit a request for a letter of map amendment called a LOMA, or a letter of map revision based on fill, which we refer to as a LOMA F, for review. And the review is a comparison of the lowest adjacent grade, which is a surveyed elevation that touches your home or building, and it's a comparison to the adjacent base flood elevation. If FEMA agrees that your building is elevated above the base flood elevation, FEMA will issue a determination that would officially remove the mandatory flood insurance requirement. The caveat with that is that it's still ultimately at your lender's discretion to require insurance if they believe there's risk. And we do have a handout available that will walk you through the process on how to prepare a letter of map amendment request. And it's also available on our website. So what are your community's responsibilities? And as we touched on, there are floodplain management regulations, and it's really important to understand that a floodplain development permit is required for all development in the high risk flood zone. And development is generally considered to be any man-made change. It's also important to know that no new structures are permitted in the high risk area within the town of Parker and Douglas County. And the floodplain development requirements will vary between the local government. So it's important to check in with your floodplain administrator. So how can you reduce your risk? Well, the first step is to know your risk. So we encourage you to review the flood maps and ask questions. We want you to understand your options, and that includes talking to your insurance agent about flood insurance. Talk to your floodplain administrator about building requirements and other ways to reduce your risk. This can be done through mitigation, which could be elevating your utilities, or for some cases, it could be installing flood vents. We would also encourage you to talk to your floodplain administrator about your community's participation in the community rating system. The community rating system recognizes community floodplain management practices and efforts to reduce risk of flooding, and flood insurance premium rates are discounted to reflect the reduced risk of flooding in your community. So, and most importantly, we want you to be prepared and to be safe. And we would want you to consider purchasing flood insurance and developing an emergency kit and plan. And the ready.gov website is an excellent resource for that information. And I think with that, we are here to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Stacy. The good news is we have a contact sheet for you at the end of this presentation, and it will be the last slide of the presentation if you do have any follow-up questions after watching this presentation. So what I will do is hand it over to John, who will take us through some features of the map viewer. John, I can see you, but I can't hear you yet.
Everyone, so I'm going to take everyone through the map viewer that the district has set up. In my opinion, this viewer is the easiest way for a property owner to look at their property to make informed insurance decisions. So the link to the viewer was on the previous slide. So if you click on that, it'll take you right to it on the PDF that you have. It's also on the district's website. Next slide. So I'm going to take you through a few screens of the viewer, and then I'll share my screen at the end and go through in more detail. But this is kind of what the viewer looks like when you open the page. You'll get this splash screen in the middle. It's created for Douglas County, but it's also Adams County is also included, and I'll show you a quick way to zoom directly to Douglas County. You can use it on any web browser. And one feature that I think what makes this the best viewer is, or the easiest way to search for your property is you can actually type in your address and go directly to your property. So if you want to go to the next slide, I think I highlight that. Oh, it's the next one after that. There are some navigation tools that I will review when I share my screen, but these are the basic tools that you will need to navigate on the viewer. You can zoom in and out. You can also use your mouse. You can zoom to see the entire county area with the home button. You can go to your location if you're sitting at home through that little circle on the right there. And then there's a legend that kind of shows you what you're looking at, what you have turned on, and what it all means. And then the layer function, you can go ahead and turn off and turn on different layers and look at different data. And then the last one is you can change what is underneath. So you can get just a street view, or you can see homes if you would like. So next slide. And so this kind of gives a little detail when you're in the viewer. This is where you can put in your address. And so I'm just highlighting, I think this is maybe a fire station that I found an address of, or some public building. It's no one's property. So when you go to the viewer, you can type in your address and it will go directly to your property, and you can see clearly where your property is. And you can even zoom in further from here, but just for this, it did not. You can also put in GPS coordinates if that's something that someone wants to do for some reason. So next slide. And then you can change the base map. So you can show a satellite image, you can show a hybrid, or you can show a road map. In my opinion, obviously the satellite image is probably the best, just because you'll be able to see the property that you're concerned about. But if you're navigating, and sometimes roads are easy to get around, if you're just panning, so you can use that as well. Next slide. And then there is the layer list, and I put this screenshot here just so that if you need to remember this, and this is maybe the more complex part we'll go over before I share, you can always reference this and see how you turn off and on layers, and that there are little drop down arrows to see what you're looking at. And sometimes you'll drop down an arrow and there'll be more things you can turn off and on. But you can go through and pick, your final mapping. You can see what the existing mapping looks like. And so that's another really great, that's how you navigate this. And I think, oh yeah, so this is highlighting. So in this viewer, when you look at the effective, it'll be this blue, and the effective is what's existing. So this is what's effective now as we speak. And it will be the layer with the blue kind of mapping, right? So with the floodway is the dark blue, our SFHA, or 1% annual chance. That's the kind of medium colored blue. And then your 500-year floodplain is that light colored view. And then the next slide, we'll see what the existing for the upcoming mapping will be. So you go to the next slide.
The next slide is the contact information. So I think that's all we had.
I thought there was one more. Well, then that's fine. We'll show it in a second, but this just kind of shows how you can navigate through those different layers. So I'm going to share my screen now, and I will take you through. So here is the map viewer that I just was playing around with, or we're showing you, reviewing on the slides. I've kind of zoomed into an area that I wanted to show us, but I can just review what we went through. The address. You put your address in here. You can search an address up here. If you want to zoom to the county, you'll go to the default extent through here. We reviewed some of these buttons. Across the top here on the right is where you will see some of the things we just talked about, like the layer list, our legend here. One thing we didn't review is the bookmark, and I'll go through that quickly because I think it's a feature, and then I will kind of click through some of this stuff. But the bookmark is handy if you want to zoom directly to Douglas County. You know, if you're in a different area, right? And just show if we're off doing something else for some reason, you want to go to Douglas County, you click on that bookmark and you can zoom to that. So that's good, gets you right to where you want to be. The other thing I wanted to review is, so when we open up our layer list, we have different boxes we can check. And where we were talking about on that slide was, this is the effective mapping with that blue kind of shading. If you want to look at the final mapping, which is going to be, you know, effective soon, you click on final mapping. And when you open, when you click the drop down, you get more functions, and you can look at the firm panels. So if you want to see the outline of each flood insurance rate map, you click that. And that's also why when we look at the final mapping, you don't see some of the extra mapping that is actually out here, because we're not changing those firms, and these are the ones we're updating. You can see which each layer, each color means if you click on the drop down. You can also come up to your legend, and it shows you what you have selected, what each layer means. I typically just stay in here just because you don't need to flip back and forth. Again, we can turn this off and turn on the effective, and then you can see what layers you're looking at. But I think we're all most concerned in this meeting with this final map, final firm floodplain information. And then the last quick thing that I will review and show you is this slicer. It's important when we do this slider, I think is what it's called, not a slicer, that it's a good way to compare what the mapping look like versus what it's going to look like. So you want to select the two layers that you want to compare. So you want to select the effective and the final flood hazard mapping. And if you hit the swipe or the slider, you can now slide this back and forth. And you can see what I have on the right here is the effective. And as I slide this to the left or to the right, on the left-hand side, we get overlaid on top is what the current or the upcoming mapping will look like, right? So you can see in this area, if we zoom in, that we're going to get a reduction. So this effective kind of mapping is going to be reduced. It's going to be a little thinner in some areas, going to get pinched in. So there's a reduction of the SFHA And you can kind of see that in this way as well. Like this all is, final upcoming mapping, and the effective, it's going to be reduced as we move this study forward. Again, I think you just saw how close. So if your property is in this area and you really want to zoom in, and you really want to see, well, you almost see what's in their backyard. It's really, really, really good. How close we are. It is very detailed, and it is a very good way to look at your property in relation to our flood zones. So that is everything that I have to share. I'm going to give it back to you, Sam.
Sounds good. So I will bring up this last slide right here. And you should be seeing all of our project team contact information. If you do have a particular question about something you saw this evening or on this presentation, these are the folks that are going to be able to hopefully get you an answer. We will have this info on the Mile High Flood District website. And we hope this has been informative for you and you learned something new. So thank you so much for attending.